The America's Quarterly Podcast is sponsored in part by Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute. Since 1985, the Institute has been at the forefront of innovation in public policy, national security, and cybersecurity. You can dive into the Gordon Institute's vast library of Latin American security-focused research, explore their academic and professional education programs, or tap into open-source data initiatives, such as the Security Research Hub or the Prosecutorial Performance Index. Shape your future and drive change. Learn more at go.fiu.edu/impact. Welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. This is a critical moment for Latin America's economies, with better-than-expected growth this year in Brazil and Mexico, but also questions over how China's growing economic problems could affect the region. In today's episode, an overview of what to expect in months ahead.
There's significant new demand coming for commodities different from China. And that's from all of the decarbonization trend that requires electric batteries, that require lithium, copper, and so on. That's a very positive story for the region. Fortunately, China is slowing down at the same time that there's some decoupling from China and commodity prices. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be a headwind for LATAM, but it's better than it could have been.
If you talk to the right people in the right places, you hear something we haven't had much of in Latin America over the past 10 years or so, and that's optimism about the economy. It's not everywhere, it's uneven, but especially in the region's two economic giants, Brazil and Mexico. Analysts have been revising forecasts upward and expecting solid growth for the rest of 2023. In other countries, including Argentina, Peru, and Chile, there are big questions about where economies are headed, largely because of politics. Today on the AQ podcast, we'll do something we try to do at least twice a year, which is a kind of tour of Latin America's economies. Who's doing well, who's doing poorly, where the risks lie, and where there might be reasons for optimism ahead. We'll try to do it with a minimum of technical language and get you a good panorama in about 30 minutes. Our guest back on the podcast is Ernesto Revilla, the chief economist of Latin America for Citigroup. Ernesto, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So, Ernesto, as I mentioned during the introduction, I hear these whispers that maybe the outlook for Latin America's economies as a whole is looking up. Nobody's getting too carried away. But I'm hearing some optimism from investors, from economists, from politicians, from people in the region. Are you hearing some of the same things? What is your general feeling about the health of Latin America's economies today?
Sure. There's no question that there's more optimism now. And this comes from a couple of different places. One is that external conditions for emerging markets or for Latin America are relatively more constructive than they were, say, 6 months ago. And in general, investors and the market thinks that the Fed is about to be done on the hiking of interest rates, if it's not the case that it's already done. And that's a tailwind for Latin America. So good external conditions. Of course, there are things that we can discuss, which is China is decelerating and so on. But in general, you would say that it's a constructive external environment. Now, on the local side, we are also seeing a lot of resilience in some economies, particularly Mexico and Brazil, where we have upgraded the growth forecast. And up until recently, I would say that investors thought that political risk in Latin America was probably lower now than 6 months ago. But of course, now we have the assassination of a candidate in Ecuador. We have the result of the PASO. So maybe we are rethinking that. But we had, for the first 6 or 7 months of the year, a constructive environment for the region.
And some of this is an inflation story. Inflation is starting to come down in most of the big economies, Argentina, which you mentioned being an obvious exception. But this is partly because the region's central banks were out ahead of the curve. They recognized the inflationary threat before certainly the U.S. Federal Reserve did. And as a result, we're now seeing interest rate cuts in Brazil and elsewhere. How important a part of the story is that?
I think it's an incredibly important part of the story because really it's one of the success stories from Latin America in economic terms recently. As you say, Latin America started the hiking cycle of interest rates earlier than in other regions in the world, when central banks, even from advanced economies, made a mistake in 2021 in thinking that inflation was going to be transitory. Central bankers in the region said, we've seen this movie before. We know that you need to fight inflation forcefully and from the start. And that meant that Latin America started earlier, but that also means that Latin America has now started the easing cycle of interest rates. I think Latin American central banks can do a victory lap so far. The fight against inflation is not done, but so far the macroeconomic management, mostly in the region, not everywhere, so, of course, but mostly has been much better than before.
So we're talking about markets, we're talking about GDP, we're talking about inflation, and fair enough. Those are all things we discuss here, and inflation in particular has an impact on real people. That said, you look at polling, you look at the poverty numbers, unemployment numbers, food insecurity numbers, and all of those suggest that people are still in a worse place, even despite this progress that you've just described, compared to where they were before the pandemic. My question is, what do you see in terms of the social situation across the region? How much longer do you think it will take for some of this progress to be reflected in the day-to-day lives of more people?
Yes, one of the problems of this macro stability that we are discussing for many countries in the region is that it has come at a cost, or actually we haven't been able to solve the fundamental problem, the fundamental economic problem of Latin America, which is growth, which is probably the summary statistic that is behind many of these outcomes that you are just discussing. The problem with the recent model of Latin American economic management is that we have been lagging behind in terms of growth. Not only that, but we are forecasting, we as the market, as analysts, that growth in Latin America in the next few years is not going to be anywhere close to the growth that we had in the past 20 years. So one part of the equation, I guess, it's kind of solved, which is macro stability in many places. Now we have to think about how to bring growth. I think the productivity story is crucial for Latin America, moving out from commodities production into higher value, but that's always easier said than done. And Brian, I don't see in the region a lot of reforms that are talking about medium-term growth, only short-term fiscal issues or slightly adjacent type of problems.
I want to talk about productivity in a second, but first just to talk about the growth numbers. Citi, the institution that you work for, your Latin American GDP growth expectation is just 1.4% for 2023, 1.8% for 2024. It's a little more bearish. It's a little more pessimistic than, say, the IMF forecasts, which are closer to 2%. This is just, for you, this is just part of this range-bound pattern of flat growth that we've been seeing over the course of many years, or is there something new to this?
No, it's basically that. It's kind of recognizing that for 2023 and 2024, there are going to be external headwinds. As we were mentioning, we've been having lots of monetary tightening. That's what's behind the start of the cuts in Latin America in interest rates. But the cuts are going to be slow, and we are going to have this impact of high interest rate going into 23 and 24. Now, having said that, there's a wide heterogeneity behind the 1.4 growth that we're expecting for this year. You have countries that are going to contract significantly, like Argentina, unfortunately, minus 4.2%. You have countries that are going to be flattish relative to last year, like Chile. You have Brazil and Mexico growing much better than what we were expecting 6 months ago, between 2.3, 2.7% in both cases. And you have countries in the Caribbean and Central America growing higher than 4%, like Panama, probably Costa Rica.
So the overall picture then is slow growth, macroeconomic stability that's more solid than maybe we expected a few months ago, and some countries that we're more excited about than others, especially the big ones, right? I mean, Mexico and Brazil, which together account for about 55 to 60% of Latin America's population and GDP.
That's exactly right. The summary of the macro picture is relatively slow growth in 23 and 24, but slowing inflation, which will continue coming down this year and the next, falling interest rates, which is good news. And as we said, Latin America is leading the world. And very interesting, Brian, stable currencies. Of course, in everything that we're discussing, as you said before, the asterisk, the exception is Argentina, but mostly in most places, stable currencies, which is again another surprise because whenever the Fed is hiking rates, you would expect some depreciation of Latin American currencies. And now we see not only very stable currencies all around, but people are talking about the super peso in some places like Colombia or Mexico, for example. We are forecasting that will continue this year and the next.
I do want to ask you about something you mentioned, which is productivity. Lots of people have focused on this. We've talked about it on the podcast quite a lot. Some studies suggest that productivity has been flat in Latin America for the better part of 50 years now, which really deprives the region of a major source of growth. The Economist had a piece about this earlier this year, which unfortunately had a really terrible headline on it, where they said a land of useless workers, and that was unfortunate. They changed it, but it distracted from the fact that it's actually a really important issue. What is the source of this problem in your mind? Keeping in mind that it's not the population's fault. People work very hard in the region. They work very long hours compared to people in developed countries, including the United States. Is there any hope for an improvement on this front in the near term, and what would it take?
Well, that's the trillion-dollar question for sure that the market analysts, policymakers, analysts, everyone is trying to think about. And I think that when we think about the economics of Latin America, we say the problem is growth. But then we say, why do we have low growth? And then we move it one step back and we say, well, the problem is productivity. And the way I think about it is that modern economies grow not because labor is growing or capital is growing, which are the two summary inputs of production, but because you become more productive at using those inputs. So in other words, modern economies grow because of increases in productivity. And productivity, in my view, comes in a very important way from the rule of law. Everything that we've been discussing about enforcing contracts, having the appropriability of the returns on your investment. And unfortunately for policy, it's multifactorial, right? Everything comes to the productivity question. I think that each country will have a binding constraint for growth that is impending productivity, but it mostly comes to the point that small firms in the region cannot grow and become more productive for many challenges and many reasons in different countries.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let's go country by country, Ernesto. Start with the big one. Let's start with Brazil. Some people have said that Lula is lucky that there has been not only a very good harvest in Brazil, but a very bad one in Argentina because of the drought there. It recalls, at least in some small fashion, the positive context that he inherited back in 2003. But it's also true that he has impressed some people in the market with this fiscal framework that his government has passed. How are you thinking about Brazil's economy right now? Is this just how much of it do you think was luck? How sustainable do you think this fast growth that we saw in the first quarter will be?
Well, this is a great framing because I might be able to extrapolate the luck discussion to other countries in the region as well, right? Many presidents, and we will discuss Mexico later, have been lucky. But as they say in soccer, there is no good goalkeeper without luck, right? So in the case of Brazil, we have very good momentum, no question about it. It comes from the fact that as they were earlier in the hiking cycle, they have been able to start cutting interest rates, and that is being felt and is going to continue being felt as a tailwind for the economy. And at the start of the Lula administration, where many thought that spending was going to be a little bit more lax and less constrained. And as you said, the new fiscal framework and the discussion on the tax reform has limited some of the worst case scenarios. which I want to be very emphatic in the sense that we don't think that this new fiscal framework and tax reform solves the fiscal situation in Brazil, but it will give a few years of calm to the markets because the total level of debt in Brazil is much better than what we were thinking in 2020 with the pandemic. So all of this combines with a favorable environment for Brazil in the short term, and I think it will last at least for 12 months, if not more.
And Ernesto, at the same time as we record this, Lula recently made an announcement where $350 billion initiative for infrastructure, kind of a new version of the PAC, the famous infrastructure package that he passed during his previous government. What do you make of this? Because he on the one, it's a lot of money. On the other hand, some of these investments are the sorts of things that highways and ports and so on that could improve productivity and kind of unlock the kind of growth that we've said is missing.
In general, it's welcome for sure. I mean, emerging market countries, Brazil in particular, need additional investment, particularly in logistics that are going to be important for the future productivity of the economy. Now, the question is, what are the projects? Are they going to be projects that have a positive return, not only in economic terms, but in social economic terms? And what's going to be the way they are going to be financed, if it's under the envelope of the fiscal framework that we were discussing, or it's going to put pressure on public finances? So net, I'd say that so far, so good. But as in other countries, we have had announcements, and then the devil is in the details for sure.
Let me ask one more question, a provocative question for you. Your contacts with investors, what are people saying about Lula at this point? Has he started to win more people over, or is it still kind of a wait and see?
I find, Brian, that the sentiment in the market, of course, varies a lot on how the price action is doing in the last few days before I talk with them, right? And I think with investors I talk to, they're generally more constructive about emerging markets now, and they are more forgiving about some of the worries that we had in the past. So bottom line, I don't see a lot of worry about President Lula right now in the market.
And it's also true that sometimes you get a little bicycle push and things start moving in the right direction, and it creates a virtuous cycle where consumer spending gets better and investor sentiment gets better and so on. So we'll see how that goes. The other large economy that has a president that investors sometimes don't quite know what to make of course, is Mexico. You revised your GDP growth expectations for this year to 2.4%. It's up from 1.9% before. That's a pretty good number. How much of this is the United States and how much of it is factors within Mexico?
Well, first, let me give you the update that we increased it again to 2.7%. So it's incredible. And Mexico, for me, is extremely interesting from an economic point of view. It's a country of contrast, an economy of contrast. You have places and sectors in Mexico that are doing very well, particularly those linked to the U.S., as you say. There are places in Mexico that are still not growing or actually contracting, particularly in the south. Then you have external sentiment about Mexico, which is incredible in the lines that we were discussing, because the macro fundamentals are strong. The nearshoring story, it's incredible how everybody's talking about the nearshoring potential for Mexico. But on the other hand, local sentiment is not as good. People continue to be worried about the institutional deterioration happening under AMLO, a lot of microeconomic distortions, and so on. But I would say that from the macro part, Mexico is doing well. And AMLO, same as what we were discussing before with Lula, has been very lucky in many respects. And on the macro side, at least, it looks good.
What do you think is the risk that this relatively positive story gets derailed by the election next year?
So I don't think anything fundamental will change in Mexico before the election. The big catalyst is the election. Now, is it a positive catalyst or a negative one? I guess the base scenario for many people is that it's going to be positive in the following sense. If the next government, the base scenario is that it's from Morena, keeps some of the macro discipline, keeps the political control that AMLO has been able to keep in the country, and then becomes a little more pragmatic, that's an extremely favorable catalyst for Mexico, and then it can ride the momentum that it's going on. On the other hand, nothing guarantees that a future government, even if it's from Morena, it's going to have as much political control as AMLO has of the different factions even within the Morena coalition, and that it's going to be as fiscally responsible as AMLO was. So in my mind, it's still an uncertain catalyst, but I guess most people are constructive on the election in 2024.
Let's talk about Argentina. Where do we start? In the wake of the PASO election, the primary/test election that took place on August 13th, last Sunday, Javier Milei did better than expected. There was then a currency devaluation, rocky road ahead. And as we record this, there's still 3 months to go until the final election. Assuming that there's a runoff, it would take place in mid-November. I'm laughing in part because it's so much of an exception to some of these positive trends that we've been talking about. What can we expect? I mean, how are you talking to clients? How are you thinking about what's ahead for Argentina?
It's an incredibly fragile macroeconomic situation, which makes it very hard to forecast and to predict. So I guess people are very wary, and the ones that were not invested in Argentina, of course, are not getting in now, are on the sidelines. There's an unsustainable trend in the macroeconomics of Argentina, starting with a big fiscal deficit. That provokes money printing, incredible pressures on inflation and FX depreciation. And now with the recent depreciation, devaluations, they are able to have some breathing room. Now, the question that I don't know the answer to, Brian, is, will this hold from here to the election? If we really think that Milei, it's his election to lose and that he really will dollarize, then we will see continuous pressure in the next few weeks and months of people dollarizing before he does it later, and that will create a self-fulfilling depreciation of the currency. That might happen, that might not happen, will depend on communication from everyone involved now, including the IMF, and I am not comfortable predicting what's going to happen next week, let alone 3 months from now.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are, and we wouldn't ask you to. Colombia is another country where the politics have been very noisy, but the macroeconomic story has looked okay. What are you seeing there?
Yes, Colombia, I think, out of the big countries in Latin America, was probably the one that had more macroeconomic vulnerabilities as compared to Mexico, Peru, or Chile, for example. Colombia had this famous problem of the twin deficits, which is a big fiscal deficit and a big current account deficit. So when you put that together with more political uncertainty at the start of the Petro administration, things look complicated. But now, where are we now? Much better situation on the macro side. There's some improvement in the fiscal situation and in the current account. And the fact that President Petro is now dealing with many local political problems makes him, in the view of the market, less able to do the more controversial reforms. So the market has interpreted the recent experiences of Colombia as positive just because it limits the worst case scenarios. So the peso has strengthened a lot, has appreciated a lot. In fact, it has been the outperforming currency in the region. And it's still a long time for the Petro administration. But I think that the market thinks that if Colombia continues advancing with macro responsibility, which, by the way, continues to be the message from the administration, from Minister of Finance Bonilla and others in the economic team, then things are going to look better in our view for 2024.
Just as an aside, Ernesto, we set out today to have a macroeconomics focused conversation. We're talking so much about politics. You're used to this as a Latin America person. I'm used to it. But do your other colleagues at Citi and at the other financial institutions who look at other parts of the world, do you think they talk about politics as much as we do?
Probably not as much, but definitely more than before. So there was this old definition, you remember, Brian, of what is an emerging market. And one of the definitions was where it's an economy where politics matter for the economic forecast, right? Under that definition, then we have much more emerging markets right now because people were talking about politics with Brexit, with the Trump administration, and so on. So but that's true. But I remember one of my old colleagues that came into Citi and started looking at what we were producing from LATAM Econ Research. And they said, well, it's a lot of politics. And we say, sure, it's difficult to talk about macroeconomics in Latin America without talking about politics.
If we look at Peru as another country, God knows political instability has been part of the story for 6 or 7 years now. The economy is not doing as well as it had, but still hanging in there, right?
Yes, but there used to be this saying that fortunately in Peru, politics did not contaminate the economics a lot. And now I think we're disputing that. We now think that all of the political noise, particularly in the first quarter of this year, really affected investor sentiment locally, and it's inciting on growth this year. We have a downward bias to our forecast this year in Peru. So I do think that politics is affecting some of the economics, at least in terms of sentiment and growth, but the fundamentals are still good, regardless.
Chile is another country with a president who came into office with a very big reform agenda, but has seen his popularity slide to a level where that agenda is not only in doubt, but there's talk that he, at least in terms of his legislative work, is kind of a lame duck at this point, even though he's still relatively early in his term. Also a country where investments have been put on hold to some extent as people wait to see where the politics will go. What's your forecast there?
So Chile, on top of all of that, had a more advanced economy looking like cycle after the pandemic. It did a lot of fiscal and monetary stimulus. That means that the economy was overheated in 2021. That means that the central bank increased interest rates quite dramatically. And now they are at the other part of that cycle with an economy that is suffering from the huge macro tightening that has been happening since 2022, not only on the monetary side, but also on the fiscal side. So in that sense, it looks more, as I said, like an advanced economy. So we're seeing basically flat growth, zero growth this year, and next year a nice rebound to 2.6%. Again, Chile's a story where the macro remains good regardless the political noise that we heard in the campaigns, and that's something welcome, I think.
Before we get to the end here, I have a couple other countries I'd like to touch on. So let's do a little bit of a lightning round. You are quite bullish in your forecast, as you mentioned, on two smaller but still important countries, Panama and the Dominican Republic, with growth forecasts above 4% for both of them. What is it about these countries that is causing them to do so well?
A big part is the U.S. The U.S. has been very resilient. These countries depend a lot on the U.S., not only on trade, but also tourism. Other countries in that region depend a lot on remittances. So the U.S. doing well, it's a very important part. And the second part is that there has been, as you know, this huge rotation from consuming goods in the world to consuming services post-pandemic. That means that we, after the lockdowns, want to go out not only to restaurants and entertainment and so on, but also tourism, and tourism helps a lot.
Last question for you, Ernesto, and it's something that you mentioned earlier, but I want to talk a little more about it, and that's China. Particularly for these South American countries, we've just seen it again over the last 20 years, that is probably, I've always said it, the two biggest things to watch with Latin America's ups and downs is probably commodities and presidents. And on the commodities front, we know that China is the big part of the story. How worried should we be by some of this talk of peak China, this idea that because of demographics and instability in their economy, that maybe they've entered a new, more stagnant phase, the recent trouble in the real estate market, employment, and elsewhere? Is there the chance that this is worse for Latin America, particularly the commodities exporting nations of South America, than we currently appreciate?
It's definitely a headwind. But if you were to ask me this question, say 4 years ago, for example, before the pandemic, that you have a crystal ball and you're forecasting that China is going to grow 5% for the foreseeable future instead of the 10% average that it did in the past 20 years, we would be very worried about Latin America, for sure. But it's interesting that China, there's no doubt that it's slowing down quite a lot, that it has a lot of structural challenges, and yet Latin America is not doing as bad. Why? Because I think a big story right now is a disconnect between Chinese growth and commodity prices. China has slowed down quite significantly, but our outlook for commodity prices in general is very stable between 23 and 24. And some commodities, for example, copper, we are actually bullish into 2024. So why the disconnect? I guess two very quick things. One is that there's significant new demand coming for commodities different from China. And that's from all of the decarbonization trend that requires electric batteries, that require lithium, copper, and so on. That's a very positive story for the region. And the second part of this discussion is that the marginal growth in China is not as commodity intensive as it was before, because it's focused more on domestic consumption rather than domestic investment. So fortunately, China is slowing down at the same time that there's some decoupling from China and commodity prices. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be a headwind for LATAM, but it's better than it could have been.
So in summary, as we said at the beginning, there's this kind of feeling like Latin America has a lot of the things that the world needs right now, not just China, but other countries as well. And that will be supportive over the next couple of years.
That's a great summary for sure.
Ernesto, you're always so clear, so concise. You give us such a broad view of what's going on. Thanks so much for joining us again on the AQ podcast.
Always a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.